All right, so let's get started. Hello and welcome to our viewers in the United States and Europe. I am Katja Donovan, Executive Director of 1014, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the sixth event in our virtual series in cooperation with the American Council on Germany. We call this series Hot Topics, Cold Realities. And in each episode, we plan to explore the issues that are being debated in Germany and in the United States. We want to unpack today's hot topics with German and American experts and discuss their maybe cold realities or the realities we are finding ourselves in.
And I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany. And as always, it's a delight to partner with Katja and the team at 1014. When it comes to hot topics and cold realities, I can hardly think of anything better than a conversation about the new US national security strategy and its implications. This is especially true in light of yesterday's speech by President Donald Trump, which picked up on many of the themes in the document. In our conversation today, we'd like to provide an initial assessment of how this new strategy redefines US commitments to allies and partners, but also what it signals about the Trump administration's approach to diplomacy, deterrence, and military engagement. Of course, we also want to focus on the impact of the national security strategy on the transatlantic partnership. I'm delighted that we're joined by two leading foreign policy and national security experts, Nico Lange and Robin Quinville. Nico is a senior fellow at the Munich Security Conference and a non-resident senior fellow at the a non-resident senior fellow with the Transatlantic Defense and Security Program at CEPA, the Center for European Policy Analysis in Washington, D.C. He also teaches at the University of Potsdam and the Hertie School of Governance in Berlin. And from 2019 to 2022, he was at the German Federal Ministry of Defense. Nico, herzlich willkommen. It's good to see you. And also with us is Robin Quinville. She's the former director of the Wilson Center's Global Europe program. And before that, she spent more than 30 years as a US diplomat, having served primarily in Europe. Her last foreign posting was as chargé d'affaires at the US Embassy in Berlin. Robin, great to see you. Thank you for being with us.
My pleasure.
So before we get started, I'd just like to remind everyone that ACG and 1014 are both nonpartisan organizations, and so the views expressed in this conversation are those of our two experts, and we see our role more as sort of moderating and sort of directing some of the conversation. But of course, we'd also like to include all of you in this exchange. So if you have a question for our speakers, please submit your question using the Q&A function in Zoom, and we will do our best to fold your questions into the conversation.
All right, so let's just get started with opening questions. So I do believe it's fair to say that the release of the new US national security strategy has provoked quite a tremendous amount of commentary from nothing new to the end of the West or to the end of Pax Americana. So we will see. And President Trump's prime speech to the nation yesterday echoed a lot of its content. Notably, I believe the peace through strength theme, sovereignty first policies, tariffs as a tool of national power, skepticism towards NATO and Europe, and I believe a prioritization of US service members over multilateral commitments. So let's see what you think about it and unpack the national security strategy, perhaps by starting to discuss what the US sees as its primary threats. And based on these threats, what the strategic priority are in this document that centers around this peace through strength approach. Robin, maybe we start with you, since you can perhaps best speak from the American perspective. I believe you've stated in previous interviews that the national security strategy represents a sharp break with past approaches, particularly in the treatment of Europe and NATO. So let me perhaps ask you, how does the new national security strategy define the primary threats facing the United States, and what does that mean for a strategic approach to those threats?
Thanks so much. The first thing I did when this came out was I reread the strategy from 2017 that the first Trump administration did, right? And it's fair to say that there are some themes that echo, but this is a very different kind of document. And for me, I always look at this as what is this going to translate to into policy, because that is the actual goal of a national security strategy. What struck me were a lot of the differences. So that this is a spiky document. It's like a porcupine. It is something that anticipates controversy, right? And I guess they decided that the best defense was a good offense, right? And that is the strategy. It's also quite short in comparison to the first Trump administration's strategy and to the Biden administration's. So it is about half the size, in a larger font, by the way, and it is very directly written. So it strikes me that it is trying to reach a broader audience than the foreign policy professionals that may have otherwise been primarily interested. It is very national in its focus, very much America first. It's restructural in that it is rejecting a lot of past assumptions, and it is focusing on some themes that have not come through in the same way in other documents. So it is focusing on peacemaking. It's focusing on balance of power, regional balance of power. It's focusing on strength, and it underlines a predisposition to non-intervention. It's transactional. And this is something that I think that really we have seen throughout the first Trump administration and in this one, there's a variety of ways. When it comes to the primary threats to the US, these run as threads throughout this document. And one of them is migration, whether that is in the US focus, in the Western Hemisphere focus, whether that is the consequences within Europe. It also focuses very much on anything that it considers to be a threat to US economic primacy in the world, with the very blunt sort of assessment that an economically strong US is good for the world in general. And that also means that the US can be stronger militarily and provide that kind of assurance for its allies. And that influences the approach to the Indo-Pacific and to the Middle East. It focuses on how these relations will strengthen our industrial base, how we can revitalize that, how we can utilize the tools of our strong financial market. So it is very much focused on anything that represents a threat to that US economic primacy. It sees as a threat unbalanced trade, and that is not a surprise given the first Trump administration as well. Even more than in the first Trump administration, it's focused on the emerging tech industry, and so anything that is a restriction or regulation in that area is actually seen as a threat. And I'd add that another threat that emerges is underperforming allies, if I can say it that way. So again, there are various pieces, especially when it comes to the regional portion that you see, but those overarching themes and an unstable Western Hemisphere, which gets a lot of attention in this national security strategy. These are the things that emerge as the key threats. This is not, as in the past, something that focuses on strategic competition or that outlines, as the first Trump administration security strategy did, threats from Russia, China, the DPRK, or Iran. This is something that is looking at these broader threads throughout. And I'm going to stop there because I can't wait to hear what Nico says.
There's so much that I would like to pick up on. But I think there's one viewer question that's really interesting that just popped up before we go to Nico and ask what the reaction is on the other side of the pond. But the viewer asked, how much is the document really focused on a foreign audience, or rather on a domestic audience? How much is it just focused on the president and showing that whoever it was who wrote it is loyal to his approach and praising of his actions? So what's behind that? So with other words, I probably, believe that the viewers are asking, how seriously do you have to take that in the foreign policy realm?
I think
If
we
you
do
could
have.
just limit to that just for a minute, and then we can talk about the repercussions on the other side.
I don't think this was written just as a document to show the president that and so forth. And by the way, every national security strategy has had an element in it of criticizing the previous administration and praising actions already taken. The Biden national security strategy only came out in October of 22, so he'd been in office nearly 2 years by then. So the first Trump administration put it out about the same time as this one in December of the first year. So it is meant to guide policy directions and decisions. It is known that it will be read throughout the US government to try to pick up on those things. It's known that it will be read by all our allies and partners, right? So I don't think it's written for a small audience. And if it were written for a small audience, it then could be that much larger, heavier document, right? This is written in direct speech in a very direct way. And so I think it is actually hoping for the kind of broader readership in a way that maybe the first two, the Biden administration and the first Trump administration, were more global in their ambition, more in the weeds in terms of specific policies.
Thank you so much for giving that background, that clarification. Nico, I believe you have described the 2025 US national security strategy as a mixed and polarizing document, noting that it reflects President Trump's America First worldview, while unsettling allies on the other side of the pond specifically. And you emphasize that the national security strategy is less about technocratic planning and more about ideological signaling. So maybe you can allude to this a little bit and just explain what the European reaction has been. What do you make? What do you make from this document?
Well, thank you for the invitation. I will be happy to share a few thoughts.
You are suddenly very quiet, Nico. I don't know if it's at our end or at yours.
Is it better now?
Yes.
Maybe I do maybe something wrong with my speakers. Okay. I was saying that I separate my analysis of the national security strategy from what you asked for, what the European reaction is, because it's not. But my view is, first of all, that President Trump is not particularly striking me as somebody who walks around with a strategy document in his hand, implementing his coherent strategy. So I think he wants to have as much freedom as possible to do whatever he likes and whatever feels right for him in that moment. And I think we should keep that in mind when discussing this national security strategy document. And from that point of view, I think the European reaction, that it was a little bit overdone, going totally hysterical about what is coming and so on. So let's calm it down a little bit. Trump will not implement the words of a national security strategy. He never has done that. And one would be amazed by reading, let's say, the German national security strategy, how much ridiculous stuff is in the German national security strategy. So let's be honest with ourselves about this. That's my first point. What I find interesting in the ideological parts of the national security strategy document is that they can be read can be read as a glimpse of how a more ideological post-Trump MAGA government could look like. And I think that is something that has to be considered. Yeah, because if you have a prolongation of Trump by people who are more ideological than him, this would actually make a lot of sense to be a kind of strategic guideline. So that's very far away from today, and we don't know what will happen, but I think it's an interesting point to look at this. There are two very important contradictions in this national security strategy from a German and European analytical point of view. The first contradiction is that, as Robin has already said, there is almost an overemphasis of the leading role of the US, especially in technology and economy, but US has to be the global leader on everything. That's how I read this document. But at the same time, there is no interest in global order. You could say from a strategy point of view, good luck with that. How can you be globally dominant without imposing and maintaining a global order? Just by portraying international policy making or international politics as a series of bilateral deals, I think it will be very difficult to establish yourself as the global leader just through a series of bilateral deals. So I find that contradictory. And the second contradiction is the whole concern about growth and technological backwardness in Europe and Europe developing in the wrong way. And then in the same document, undercutting the main source of growth in Europe, which is European integration. Europe will not be able to be a stronger partner without European integration. The single market and the European economic power, the European trading power, they are the sources for European strength. To believe you can split up Europe into national entities again by bringing, as the national security strategy seems to believe, the right parties into power in all European countries, so that then there would be strong Europe again by making it national. It's contrafactual. That's not how Europe got strong, by having individual small nations. They are easier to deal with, and they maybe are an easier counterpart when it comes to digital technology regulation or to trade or to other issues. I understand that. But if you want the Europeans to be strong, you have to support European integration. It's not working in another way. On the perception of this document, I already said one thing. I think it was over-perceived in many European capitals, including in Berlin. Over-interpreting what the national security strategy document is, and of course being very offended by many, especially by the attacks on the European Union that many people seem to have found in this document. And what I share in this perception is that there is a new fashion in the US to have a very condescending tone vis-a-vis the Europeans. And I think it would be better to get out of fashion with that tonality. It's more an atmospheric thing, but nobody likes this tone of condescension. And it will also not lead to partnerships or to friendships or to people doing what Donald Trump likes them to do. It will lead to reactance and resistance. Nobody likes to be talked at like that. It's something that is not only in the document. I think you can see it otherwise as well. But the document is encouraging everybody. I've noticed this throughout the week on conferences and events that I've been, that random Americans had felt encouraged to talk top down to me about what the Europeans are and what the Europeans should do and why the Europeans are bad at this and bad at this. I think that's not helpful. It's also not helpful the other way, but of course, this mutually resisting, mutually reinforcing ways of talking in a bad way, Americans about Europeans and Europeans about Americans, it's not helping anybody, especially in a situation, and that's the last point I want to make, especially in a situation where Putin's best strategy at the moment is to play on the rift between America and the Europeans. That's the only play he has at the moment. All the Russian information and disinformation business is focusing on that question. So there are also, I think, very robust reasons not to have that tonality between Europeans and Americans at this point in time. There are many other things, but we can discuss them later. On China, where there's not much in there. On Russia, that is perceived only as a problem for the Europeans. And on some maybe reassurances that are missing, but I'm switching with my last sentence to my personal opinion again. Not reassuring the Europeans at this point, I think, can be quite helpful, but because the Europeans have to do stuff themselves. And in that sense, parts of the message are the message we hear for decades now from the US. Europeans taking care of their own security is necessary. Maybe this is now brought forward in an unfriendly way, but I think it's a legitimate argument to make, and the Europeans have to do more.
Thank you so much. So before we dig into these many topics that you already put on the table, let me just ask you one follow-up question. Thank you for pointing out the contradictions and also speaking about the overreaction in some European capitals, maybe not from Brussels, but in individual European capitals. When you talk about that, I'm just curious, what do you think? Was there anything really, except for maybe the condescending tone, that was new in this strategy that, we haven't really, that was surprising, that has not been on the horizon, like that has not been a policy of the administration anyway. So were European leaders surprised by anything in the strategy, or was it like, oh, wow, it's just now in writing, basically, what we've seen all along?
No, I think the interested observer was not really surprised, but things have been taken to a different quality. I mean, J.D. Vance giving a speech at the Munich Security Conference about the alleged problems with freedom of speech in Europe and promoting what I would call the right populist international movement is one thing. But having this in written form in the national security strategy of the White House is a different quality. And the different quality, I think, makes a difference. It can be an old argument, but it, of course, makes a difference if it's now officially a document of the White House. And it can only be perceived as an offense. I sometimes go back to people here and say, look, all of you supported the opponents of Trump in both elections that he was in. Maybe there's an element of revenge here also. Let's also look at the way we react to domestic political issues in the US. But I can only report, and you have seen this, it's perceived as an attack on democratic decision-making in Europe, if it's portrayed that way in the national security strategy. And I think one of the surprises for experts was that after all the talk about how the big confrontation will be with China and how the main opponent is China and how Europe has to do more because the US has to use the resources in China, there's so little on China in the national security strategy. Where is all that stuff? And I think some already get the suspicion, oh, maybe it's about making a deal with China at the expense of everybody else. It's not even about confronting China. So that is something I think that was, at least to some, was new. Where is all this that they are telling us all the time? Why it's not in there?
We've gotten a number of comments from people in the Q&A, and I want to fold some of those in because I think that we're unpacking a very challenging and a very difficult issue. One of our viewers, said something along the lines of what you were just talking about, Nico, that there were not that many surprises in this national security strategy because we've heard pieces of this, beginning with the Vance speech, but also thinking about, a new Monroe Doctrine type of agreement, right? The whole debate over Greenland, what's going to happen there. And so the bottom line of the message is sort of not the US necessarily abandoning Europe, as one of the viewers writes, but really wanting Europe to finally take more responsibility when it comes to its own defense. And as you said, Nico, this is not a new message. It's one that the Europeans have heard before. But certainly as somebody who attended the Munich Security Conference this year, and people would say, this is a wake-up call after hearing JD Vance. My response was, it's a five-alarm fire, not a wake-up call. The wake-up calls have been going unheeded. But one of the viewers is really curious about whether the national security strategy doesn't explicitly call for regime change in Western Europe and really a breaking up or weakening of the EU, and asks, has the United States morphed from being an ally to becoming a foe? And I'd be interested in hearing each of your responses to that question.
Okay, Steve, I'm willing to leap in there, boldly here. So here we go. I don't think we have become a foe, right? But what you are seeing with this is two things. First, the emphasis on nation states, I take as a corollary of the concern about the regulatory abilities of the European Union. I mean, it goes back to economic strength. They see the EU not as something that is a peace project for Europe, but as a regulatory body that poses a direct challenge to the development of US technology and US technology companies, et cetera. And that this is a growth area now, especially with AI. And so that this is an area where it comes up against our economic interests. There was in the first Trump administration also an emphasis on sovereignty in nation states, but this is really doubling down on this. There's very little mention of the European Union in this document, and it comes in that regulatory capacity. So put that link in there, that it is the regulatory piece of this and the EU's role in that as a transnational entity that this national security strategy is identifying, and it's why it looks and repeats the theme from the first Trump administration of sovereignty of European states. So it's also not a surprise that because of this, the strategy portrays Europe as in crisis economically and from migration. And this is, again, it's seen in an ideological sense here. So that pointing out that migration is not just a threat to the US, but in this sense, they see it as a threat to Europe. And that is Europe changing? And does that mean the relationship has to change? It is a through line that I think is easy to misinterpret. I agree with Nico that on tone, tone matters, but let's not ignore where the actual problems are indicated, despite the tone. And so this isn't something where it is the U.S. it has gone from friend to foe. This document is pointing out the key irritants in this relationship. Defense spending has been a theme. Lord, my talking points were the same under Obama as they were under President Trump in the first administration on this. Please spend more. Europe is stepping up and doing that. I think that showing progress on that is fine. But at the bottom, you need to look and see what they are indicating is the problem and try and address that. If the theme is that threats to US economic strength are a key threat, then interpret this look at sovereignty in the way that it is threatening to the US as an economic power.
Let me come back to the military budget side of things in just a second, because you're talking a little bit about some of the threats, and I think that terms like civilizational erasure are very disconcerting, right? That's something that comes up in this. There's definitely a criticism of NATO expansion and real concern about what is happening in Europe. And as one of our viewers writes, the national security strategy is pretty explicit about the United States and its diplomatics supporting civilizational allies, so far-right parties in domestic European politics. And so I'd be interested in hearing maybe from you, Nico, first, and then from you, Robin, how seriously you take that criticism and that alliance as well.
Well, first of all, it's something the critics here have to be aware of, and I think it's an element of honesty in the debate. I think somebody is not on mute. Okay, in the debate that we have problems with migration and with integration policies in Europe. There is the danger of technological backwardness, which will be dangerous to our economies. I think that there is some truth in this analysis, and we have to be honest about this. At the same time, overexpressing this as all Europe will turn into Islamist caliphates is the Russian talking point, of ideologically looking into those problems. And I mean, talking for my country, Friedrich Merz and his government are not the prolongation of the Democratic Party in the US. They are not the political opponents of Donald Trump and GOP. So extending the domestic political debate of the United States into Europe does not make much sense. Also because we have many more parties than two in most of our political systems. It will be very difficult to make distinctions of who is ours and who is theirs, if that should be the approach of the United States. And also the theological argument that says, look, there is a tendency now and all governments in Europe will become a certain way. I think it's empirically wrong. We have some European countries who already had right-wing populist governments, and they have different governments now. Viktor Orban might lose the elections in Hungary in April. So I do not, I mean, also from this point of view, I do not see it, as a very strategic way of looking into Europe if the assumption is everything will turn into right-wing populist governments over some period of time. And of course, a lot of right-wing populist governments that, from the perspective of this national security strategy, are could be partners of the US. They are anti-American to the bone. So how's that going to work out? Yeah, they hate America. They hate everything about the US and about a partnership with the US. I do not think that this kind of feeling yourself as part of a fellow political movement can bridge this anti-Americanism that is there. So I think it's also a trade-off that should be considered from the US side, being very offensive towards the partners that have been working with you all the time and embracing new partners that have so many anti-American elements. It does not seem to be, because we are talking about national security strategy, it might be something for party-to-party relations to consider, but as a national security strategy of a government, I'm not sure. Maybe the International Relations Office of the GOP should work on that, not the White House. And on the other parts, on defense spending and such, maybe the analysis is not quite recent. I mean, the numbers of immigrants coming illegally to Germany has been brought down very significantly over the last months. And the defense spending in Germany will be from 80 billion this year to 106 billion next year, up to 162 billion in 2029. So I would be, in the Trump administration, I would be proud of this achievement, having brought the Europeans finally to where they need to be, especially in important countries such as Germany. And maybe the last point, loosely related to that, is what I hear very often now in Europe is that more and more the US sees Germany, because of its defense spending, as the primary partner in Europe. And countries such as Poland, other countries in Central Eastern Europe and maybe in Northern Europe, they are not only happy about this. I mean, this is also, I think, that has to be considered in this context. because the combination of having Germany as the primary partner and supporting the AfD will be perceived extremely negatively, I think, by many other countries in Europe. So I would not advise the US to embrace both of those elements at the same time.
Thank you. There's so much that you said there that I agree with, but I also want to give Robin a chance to weigh on this question of the new right, but also whether the national security strategy doesn't sort of indicate perhaps a new global order to come. And part of that ties in with, the far right, but part of it also ties in with maybe some new alliances that we can see.
So I'll start with the piece that I think has been, for those of us that work on transatlantic relations, and particularly with Germany, the most difficult, and that is, as Nico rightly says, it's this question of what the language in the national security strategy on civilizational decline, on the working with the far right, actually will mean in practice. And I think what we're seeing is that they are putting down a marker. They also see coalition governments as minority governments, as inherently unstable. And since we realize that so many European governments actually are always coalitions, there is never a majority government in that. It's simply a different system where parties are not as broad and bringing them into a two-party system in that way. And even in Britain, which is a famously two-party system, we're seeing that fraction. So I look at this and I think, right, there is here a clear preference being stated, and that will have impact on how the administration goes about its work with allies and partners. And that's the thing that I think we as transatlanticists really have to watch here. It is a change, no question. It's a change from how we have dealt with, for example, AfD in the past. But that change was foreshadowed when Vice President Vance met with the leader of AfD on the margins of the Munich Security Conference. What will it mean when they talk about relationships with Central and Eastern European and Southern European governments? What does this mean? How does that play out in reality? Is this something where you are building a new coalition or a informal coalition of governments in discussion with each other about EU actions and others? It matters because of what it will implement. About what it shows about where their thinking is going. It tells you that there will be more meetings with the AfD, and there was a delegation recently in town here in DC. So look at that, and it shows a preference. If they are thinking, okay, the far right is on the rise throughout Europe, that may or may not be held up by elections that happen in the coming years. But what they will be doing is more discussion with those parties, and we should be prepared to, as transatlanticists, to make sure that they understand the full impact that, as Nico says, the anti-Americanism, the anti-Semitism that is very much a part of the rhetoric that many of these people use.
In Nico's, I'm switching topics a little bit. In Nico's initial assessment, he talked a little bit about some of the contradictions that are inherent in the national security strategy and also in how we're seeing things play out. And as you both know, the U.S. Congress recently passed the National Defense Authorization Act with bipartisan support. And it's a bill that really authorizes, I guess, $9 billion for military programs, and basically is a recommitment to NATO, even though it doesn't expand funding for new initiatives. And it shows a readiness to continue to be present in Europe and to keep U.S. forces stationed in Europe. It seems to me that a lot of money is going into shoring up European defense, if one looks at that agreement, despite the tone and tenor of the national security strategy. What are the thoughts that the two of you have on the defense spending side of things?
Well, on this, Congress, of course, is the funding arm, and so they are indicating a preference, right? And I think this is actually very interesting. We're still here in Washington waiting for the National Defense Strategy and also the Force Posture Review. And honestly, I'm thinking those things should be turning up any day. So they are much anticipated because the Force Posture Review will tell us a lot about implementation of the national security strategy, frankly. And so really, like, everybody be on the lookout for that, and we're gonna need to dive into that because it will show us a great deal about where they see the threats. And even this national defense strategy, it foreshadows a repositioning of U.S. military assets for the Western Hemisphere, which frankly is already happening.
Mm-hmm. Nico, any thoughts on the defense spending side of things?
Well, in addition to what I said already on this, I think there has to be awareness in the US that already the speech by J.D. Vance at the Munich Security Conference and now this document, it also has consequences on defense spending and defense cooperation between European countries and the US. And I think if you want to put it in broad terms, the times of foreign military sales are coming to an end. So you cannot expect European Union or European NATO countries raising their defense budgets and then just transferring the money to the US government to buy US weapons and technologies. There is now a very strong sovereignty argument in every procurement that is made in European NATO countries. And it will be even stronger with the more technologically advanced procurements. So if you are an AI-driven company providing AI-supported battlefield capabilities, every procurement office in Europe will tell you, we need to procure this with a European capability. Even if you produce ammunition, you will hear the argument, we will procure US missiles for Patriot if there is a production line of Patriot missiles in Europe with a supply chain that is European. So that is, I think, something that is just, it's a logical consequence of that discussion, but I think it is something many are not aware in the US, that the Europeans doing more for security will also spend more European.
Mm-hmm. I agree, Nico. This is something we actually have to, as Americans, accept that if we are calling for a stronger Europe, that Europeans are going to need to rebuild their defense industrial base, and they are going to inevitably make it more buy European than before. And that is going to be hard for Americans to accept. I can see that already.
Yeah, but you cannot be passive aggressive about it, right? It's one or the other. And I think it's good, but it will lead to a next level, because if the Europeans are really investing into European strategic enablers, mm-hmm. then they will generate a European ability to act, even in cases where the US is not interested in acting or where the US does not want them to act. And it's certainly part of Europe becoming adult, but it's just a logical continuation of that discussion.
That's right.
I, from my point of view, believe the European military presence in Ukraine should be the first time Europe uses its own ability to act in security. But unfortunately, we are moving there only very slowly.
Yeah. Talking about trade, there's so many viewer questions, and we apologize. We might have to group them in at a later stage. But I would like to take you up on the topic of trade, since you just mentioned that. And Robin, in your opening statement, you talked about the transactional character of the foreign policy and the economic primacy that the US is trying to sustain. So let's just talk a little bit about that and the focus on bilateral trade agreements, especially balancing trade with China, protecting US industries. There's just recently been a trade truce between the US and China. Can you just allude a little bit on the economic aspects of the national security strategy and what you think about that? Robert, maybe you want to go ahead and start with that.
In this, Nico is right. There's going to be there's a lot of flexibility that's going to be utilized here. In that way, there are threads about U.S. economic primacy, importance of not being dependent on supply chains, the importance of critical minerals and so forth, and they play throughout this line. But there's not a lot of specificity on trade agreements and so forth. What's been negotiated so far are really kind of frameworks, right? If you look at the trade agreement with the EU, trade agreement with the EU or with the UK, these are outlines, really. They affect the tariff levels that the president has put on goods, but it is not a trade agreement in the old sense, like how should I put this, incredibly humongous negotiations over TTIP and TPP and things like that. Those are the classic traditional trade agreements, and I don't think that we're going to see those again because they are essentially too comprehensive and they require a high level of detail involved, and they require congressional approval, again, which is not something that is easy to get. So what you're going to have are a series of these kind of frameworks that are endlessly renegotiable. And the national security strategy, it pulls in outlines of how to preserve economic primacy, what key issues are important for us, again, strategic minerals in the Western Hemisphere, pushing back on competitors, non-hemispheric competitors. But you do not have something that says, and we're going to do these, seek these sort of specific things in the way that previous national security strategies have. So they're preserving their flexibility there. And I think it's important for us, again, those of us that are invested in the transatlantic relationship, to remember that these are, in fact, whatever is negotiated appears to be something that is for now, but who knows for how long. Nico, I'd love your thoughts on this, actually.
Nico, do you have any comments on that? And maybe
No,
also
all I can say is,
go ahead.
all I can say is, I mean, not many people in Germany or in Europe know what the Monroe Doctrine was and what the Trump corollary of a Monroe Doctrine might be. So that's why I think this point was overlooked a little bit, and also because of the attacks on Europe did not have the bandwidth to deal with that as well. But I think it's clear that this hemispheric thinking is contradictory to a European approach that does not allow for zones of influence or hemispheres. And the logical question that will arise is, what does it mean for Taiwan? What does it mean for Ukraine? What does it mean for other issues? I think that will be especially a German discussion, because Germans love coherence and also want to apply everything to everything. But it's a relevant question. And of course, you will see many in the discourse in Germany, especially, but probably also in Spain and France, where there's a huge critique on US policies, siding with the other side when it comes to US doing things in Latin America. I think you will see that very quickly, as you have seen Spain and many parts of Europe siding with Gaza or even with Hamas instead of siding with Israel. It's not the same thing, but I think the US has to be aware of the unintended consequences that this might have, and difficulties that might arise elsewhere. But this depends more on, for example, what is practically happening in Venezuela right now than on the wording on hemispheres in the national security strategy.
One of the things that the national security strategy has is tucked in there an expectation that European allies and others will actually be helpful in the in us achieving our goals in the Western Hemisphere, which I thought was very interesting. There's a actually, I should try and find the line, but it would show you that I've got papers everywhere around me. But there is something where we have to be aware that their leverage will be used to try and say, right, we are trying to achieve this goal. How can you help on that goal?
Yeah, and I mean, it will be hard for Spain. Yeah, it will be hard. It will be hard for France. It will be an interesting experiment for Germany if we should align the cooperation, including development aid that we are doing in Latin America, with the US approach of making this US hemisphere. Yeah, I'm not sure how this is working. But it's of course relevant in a time where the US decided it does not need USAID anymore and all of those instruments. What are the instruments of working in those regions, and how can we cooperate? Through development work, there were at least similar instruments, and we could align, and we could, by the way, we could have done this more, but we could be more powerful in achieving something together. And where we did this, by the way, one country I worked in Ukraine, we aligned the instruments we had as Germans, as Europeans, and as Americans, and I think it was part of a success there. That will be more difficult now, even if the US expects cooperation. How to actually do it? What instruments are we aligning here? Yeah, but maybe this needs to be specified in concrete policies, and we will find out. And we will find out when the US is approaching us. What the Europeans, I think, should learn, and where the US is better now, and I don't think it's a bad thing, even if you could say this from a normative point of view, but the Europeans are not very good in connecting different fields of policymaking with each other. But of course, it makes total sense in a geopolitical environment to say, yes, we have to connect our, arms exports with getting refinery capabilities of certain rare earths and metals back in return, and not only do this with one hand and with the other hand doing something different. And this will also be necessary vis-a-vis the US, because I think the implicit deal that is in this national security strategy is, well, the US is willing to partner with Europe over European security if the Europeans are doing a little bit less on digital regulation and then technology regulation of US companies. But it will be very hard for the Europeans to implement this. What the European Commission does, what certain national countries are doing. Yeah, even if you have the idea that this could be a possible new deal, how do you actually get there? It's very hard for the Europeans.
I I completely agree that this is hard for Europeans to see these as linkages, but there probably will be, and this national security strategy foreshadows linkages between things that have been separated as hard power or geostrategic competition or whatever kind of realm or multilateral cooperation. Now there's going to be a clear link with the economic implications for the US, and the US is ready to use its economic leverage in achieving some of these other goals. And I think that that's also what's new about this national security strategy.
I have to go in a bit, but I have one more point that is important to me. That's why I'm doing it now. It's an atmospheric point, but it's still important. Mm-hmm. If you see during the last days when there was this negotiation marathon in Berlin, one could observe it, how angry Friedrich Merz is with the Americans. As somebody who was the head of the Atlantic Brücke, who is now the chancellor of one of the more powerful countries in Europe, somebody who has been transatlantic all of his life, I think I would consider the question, are we still friends? An important question. I would not underestimate this. And I'm talking about Friedrich Merz here, but think Central Eastern Europe. think countries that are at the border of the European Union to the east, who very much relied on the US and on the friendship with the US for decades. At some point, the US, I think, has to clarify and give an answer to the question, are we still friends? This is, saying we want the best for you and we want you to be strong because you are in civilizational decline. This is not an answer to the question if we are still friends. It's necessary to make. The Munich Security Conference 2026 will be a good opportunity to do that.
Nico, those were great closing words, and we are down to the wire. I feel like we have skimmed the surface of the national security strategy and all of the topics and themes that we could have unpacked. I hope that we can continue the conversation in the new year because many of the themes that we've touched on are ones that will continue to affect us. I think it's particularly important to think about the transactional nature of the national security strategy, but also one of the points that you were making, Robin, about the linkages between national security, but also economic interests and how that is changing the mindset and the framework. But also, one of the points that you brought up early on, Nico, about the tone and tenor of this, that many Europeans might feel abandoned or even targeted by US rhetoric. And yet, as both of you have underscored, there are so many areas where the US and Europe need to continue to work together in one way or another. We didn't get to talk about sort of some of those opportunities and where you see those opportunities for collaboration, but maybe we can do that again on another occasion. For now, it's my pleasure on behalf of both 1014 and the American Council on Germany to truly thank both of you for taking the time to talk with us. Many thanks also to all of our viewers and for the great questions. I'm sorry that we couldn't get to all of them, but obviously, given the interest in this discussion, I think it's something that we need to focus on again. So thank you both once more.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Thank you. Good to see you, Robin.
Good to see you too, Nico.